I live in an old house in the suburbs of Boston, built in the early 1900s. The brick walls and creaky wooden stairs give the place a sense of history. Although the house was a bit worn, I liked its unique atmosphere. For the first few months after moving in, everything was fine. Quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, it all felt perfect. But then, one night, things started to feel wrong. It was around 2 a.m. when I was woken up by a strange sound. It was coming from the stairs, heavy and deliberate, like someone walking slowly in heavy boots on the wooden steps. At first, I thought it must be the neighbors. After all, with an old house like this, sound could travel in strange ways. But as I listened more closely, I realized the noise was coming from inside my own house. The footsteps were rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was slowly climbing my stairs. I lived on the second floor, and above me was only the attic, which I kept locked. No one ever went up there. The footsteps grew louder, getting closer, and then stopped, like they were paused halfway up the stairs. My heart started pounding in my chest, a cold sweat creeping over my skin. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just the house settling, old wood creaking in the night. But the footsteps started again, moving toward my bedroom. The unease grew until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to check it out. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to guide my way as I got out of bed. The hallway outside my room was pitch black, except for the narrow beam of light from my phone. Step by step, I crept toward the stairs, heart hammering in my chest. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of being watched became, like something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. When I reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps suddenly stopped. Silence. The kind that presses down on your ears and makes you painfully aware of your own breathing. I slowly descended the stairs, each step causing the wood beneath me to groan softly. Finally, I stood in front of the attic door. It looked the same as always, closed, undisturbed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting on the other side. Summoning all the courage I had, I gripped the handle and turned it slowly. The door creaked open. The attic was dark, the air stale with the smell of dust and old wood. Shining my flashlight around, I saw the familiar shapes of old furniture and boxes, exactly where they'd always been. But just as I was about to leave, I heard it, a soft, faint breath behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering over empty space. There was nothing there, but the cold in the air was unmistakable, biting into my skin. I slammed the attic door shut and bolted back to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The footsteps continued over the next few nights, always around the same time, always moving slowly up the stairs. Sometimes it was a heavy, deliberate pace. Other times, it was quicker, like someone running. Each time I'd go to check, the sounds would stop before I reached the stairs. But the worst part was the feeling. Every time I approached the attic, it was as if someone, or something, was watching me from the darkness. Finally, I decided to have a locksmith come and check the attic door. I told him about the strange noises, half expecting him to laugh it off. He didn't seem too concerned, casually inspecting the lock. But then he paused, frowning as he looked closer. "This lock, it looks like it hasn't been opened in decades," he said, his voice uneasy. "It's rusted, hasn't been touched in a long time." A chill ran down my spine at his words. After the locksmith left, I started looking into the history of the house. What I found made my skin crawl. Decades ago, a man who lived in this house had been found dead in the attic, having hanged himself. His death was mysterious, and no one had been able to explain why he did it. The neighbors rarely spoke about it, and the house had stood empty for years after. The footsteps grew more frequent after that, almost every night. They no longer stopped at the stairs. They moved all the way to my bedroom door. I began losing sleep. My nerves shot from the constant feeling of dread. I couldn't stay there any longer. On my last night in the house, as I packed my things, the footsteps were louder than ever, each step heavier, as if whatever was on those stairs didn't want me to leave. I hurried out, locking the door behind me for the final time. The moment the door clicked shut, the footsteps stopped, as if the house knew I wouldn't be coming back. I never returned to that house, but sometimes late at night, I can still hear the sound of those footsteps echoing in my mind. a reminder of something I'll never fully understand. Chicago winters are always cold and quiet, especially when a snowstorm hits. That night, heavy snow fell outside, the wind howling as it slapped against the windows, echoing down the empty street. I was alone in the house. My wife was away on a business trip, so I decided to spend the evening cooking dinner. The warmth inside was a comforting contrast to the bitter chill outside, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot, when I suddenly felt it, someone watching me. The feeling was so strong, like a pair of eyes fixed on my back from the kitchen doorway. At first, I thought it was my cat, but then I remembered that she would never just quietly stare. She'd either meow or rub against my legs. I turned around to check, but there was nothing there. The doorway was empty. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, and returned to cooking. But only a few minutes later, the feeling came back, stronger this time, like something was standing there, watching, with a presence that carried a strange sense of unease. I stopped what I was doing and turned again. Nothing. The kitchen was as empty as before, but a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so I glanced toward the kitchen window. Outside, the snow had piled up, and the light from the kitchen made it hard to see anything clearly beyond the glass. But for a split second, I thought I saw something. A shadow, or maybe a reflection. I walked over to the window, but all I saw was the fog of condensation from the cold outside and the heat from within. No shadow, no figure, just the snow swirling in the night. I started to feel silly for getting so spooked, but as I turned back to the kitchen, something caught my eye. On the surface of the fridge door, which was shiny like a mirror, I saw a reflection of the entire kitchen. And there in the reflection was a face. It wasn't mine. The face was blurry, but I could make out the twisted features, the mouth slightly curled up in an eerie, unnatural smile. I froze, my heart racing as I stared at the reflection. It didn't move, just stayed there grinning at me. I didn't dare turn around. I kept staring at the fridge, at that strange, distorted face, my breath catching in my throat. Finally, I forced myself to move. I took a deep breath and slowly turned to face whatever was behind me. But when I did, the kitchen was empty. Nothing was there. The chill in the room, however, didn't go away. It lingered, crawling up my back like an icy hand. I quickly left the kitchen, flipping off the lights and locking myself in the living room. I tried to calm myself down, but the unease stuck with me. The next few days were uneventful, and although I didn't see the face again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me every time I entered the kitchen. A few days later, my wife returned from her trip. I didn't tell her about the incident at first. I didn't want to worry her. But life slowly returned to normal. The strange feelings in the kitchen faded, and I began to convince myself that maybe I'd just been tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But then, one night, it happened again. We were watching TV in the living room when we both heard it, something from the kitchen. A faint, soft thud, like the sound of the fridge door closing. I paused the TV and turned to my wife, who looked just as confused as I felt. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes wide. I got up and headed to the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen lights were off, but everything seemed normal. The fridge door was closed, and nothing appeared to be out of place. Still, something felt off. The air was heavy, thick with that same uneasy feeling from before. As I walked closer to the fridge, I caught a glimpse of the same reflection I had seen days before. The face was back. It was clearer this time, its wide eyes staring right at me, the mouth still twisted into that sinister smile. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look behind me. Again, nothing. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. But then my wife began to sense it too. She hadn't seen the face, but she said that sometimes, late at night, she could hear faint whispers coming from the kitchen, like someone was quietly talking. Every time she got up to check, though, the sounds would stop. The tension in the house grew, and one night, everything reached a breaking point. I had just finished a phone call and was heading to the kitchen to grab some water. As I approached the doorway, a strange smell hit me, a mix of mold and something rotting. My stomach turned and I hesitated before stepping inside. But when I did, the sight in front of me nearly made me scream. The fridge door was wide open and the food inside had been knocked over, spilling onto the floor in a mess of rotting smells. And there, standing right in front of the open fridge, was the face. This time, it wasn't a reflection. It was there, staring at me with those wide eyes and that horrible, unnatural smile. I stumbled back, nearly falling as I tried to get away. Just as I turned to run, the fridge door slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. I bolted out of the kitchen, heart pounding in my chest, and woke my wife. We grabbed a few essentials and left the house, driving to a friend's place to stay for the night. The next morning, we called a realtor. We couldn't live there anymore, not after what we had experienced. Whatever was in that house clearly didn't want us there. We sold the house and moved out shortly after. I never told the buyers what had happened, but I wonder if they've seen it, the face with the twisted smile that haunted us. Even now, sometimes late at night, I'll think about that night in the kitchen, and the memory of that smile still sends a chill down my spine. When my wife and I moved into this house in San Francisco, everything seemed perfect. We were preparing for our first child, busy with setting up the nursery and buying baby supplies, filled with excitement for the future. The house was a bit old, but it was spacious, with a large backyard that would be perfect for our child to grow up in. Everything felt normal during the first few months, until one night, something strange happened. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up suddenly, hearing a faint sound. At first it was distant, barely noticeable, but then it grew louder. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. At first I thought I must be dreaming. After all, our baby hadn't been born yet. There was no possible way for a baby to be crying in our house. I turned over, trying to shake it off, but the crying sound didn't go away. It became clearer, as if it was echoing through the living room. I opened my eyes, a strange unease settling in my chest. The crying was too real, too persistent. There was something about it that felt wrong. It wasn't just a baby's cry, it carried a deep sense of sorrow. Hesitant, I got out of bed and made my way down the hallway. The house was dark, my footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. When I reached the living room and flicked on the lights, the crying stopped. The room was empty, exactly as I had left it before going to bed. I stood in the center of the room, heart pounding, staring into the silence. There was nothing out of place, no open windows, no signs of anything unusual. It felt like I had imagined the whole thing. After checking the house, I returned to bed, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired, but in the following days, the crying returned. Every night, around the same time, 3 a.m., it would begin. Sometimes the cries were sharp and shrill, other times they were soft and heart-wrenching. Each time I would go to investigate, the sound would stop just as I entered the living room, leaving me in the same eerie silence as before. My sleep started to suffer. I became restless, irritable, and uneasy. My wife noticed the change in me, but she was nearing the end of her pregnancy, and I didn't want to worry her with these strange occurrences. I told her I was just stressed from work. One night, I decided to record the sound. I needed proof that I wasn't going crazy. As the clock hit 3 a.m., the crying started again. I pressed record on my phone and waited, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable. There was a baby crying in my house. My skin prickled as I listened. The cries seemed to fill the air with a cold, creeping tension. The next morning, I rushed to play the recording for my wife. I hit play, expecting to hear the cries I had recorded. But there was nothing. The recording was completely silent. No baby cries, no sound at all, just dead air. I stared at my phone in disbelief. How could the cries be so clear to me, yet leave no trace on the recording? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Desperate for answers, I started digging into the history of the house. I reached out to the real estate agent and then the local historical society. I combed through old records, trying to find anything that might explain what I was experiencing. Eventually, I found an old newspaper article that sent a chill down my spine. Decades ago, the house had been owned by a young mother. After giving birth, she began to suffer from severe postpartum depression. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly. One day, in a fit of madness, she smothered her newborn baby with a pillow. When the neighbors heard her screaming, they rushed over and found her sitting in the living room, holding her baby's lifeless body. She was later sent to a mental institution, and the baby had died right there, in the very room where I had heard the cries. As I read those words, a cold dread washed over me. The baby's cries, the ones that had haunted me every night, were coming from the same place where that child had died. My mind filled with dark, unsettling images. The mother's face twisted in grief, the baby's helpless wails. Was the baby's spirit still trapped here, crying out for help? That night, I heard the cries again. But this time, I didn't go to the living room. I stayed in bed, listening as the wails echoed through the house, growing louder and more sorrowful. It felt like the air around me was pressing down, as if the house itself was suffocating in grief. I knew I couldn't live there anymore. I contacted a local medium, hoping she could help cleanse the house or at least give me some explanation. She was an older woman with a serious, almost grave expression. As soon as she entered the house, she told me there was something that hadn't moved on. She performed a cleansing ritual, lighting incense and candles, muttering prayers or chants in a language I didn't understand. The house felt unnaturally still during the ritual, and a strange, heavy scent filled the air. The medium told me that the baby's spirit had been restless because it had never been properly put to rest. That night, the crying returned for what would be the last time. The medium had warned me that it might take one final night for the spirit to leave. I lay in bed, listening to the heart-wrenching cries, waiting for them to end. And by morning, they did. The house fell into a silence that felt different. But even though the crying had stopped, I knew I couldn't stay. We moved out before our child was born. I didn't want my family or my child growing up in a house tainted by such tragedy. Even though we left, that haunting experience stayed with me. Every time I hold my newborn, I can't help but remember those nights. The desperate cries of a child lost in the darkness, echoing through the house, never to be forgotten. That's today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.